Hey folks, tonight we begin with the polished floors, hushed corridors, and velvet curtains of a life that looked like privilege, but felt more like permanent house arrest. We're talking about royal servants in the Middle Ages, the ones who walked beside kings but couldn't look them in the eye, who slept in rat-filled storerooms and wore silk uniforms they didn't own. It sounds like status, but really, it was survival. One missed curtsy, one spilled goblet, and your career, or your head, was over. So before you settle into bed, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of dark, sleepy history keeps you company at night. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and whether it's night or morning in your corner of the world. I always love seeing who's tuning in, even if you're already halfway asleep. Now, dim the lights. Maybe open a window for that faint breeze or background hum. Get comfortable, stay quiet, and let's quietly slip into a world where being near power didn't make you powerful. It just made you very, very expendable. From a distance, serving royalty looked kind of amazing. You wore fine clothes. You stood beside kings. You helped queens into carriages. You walked across marbled halls while peasants outside walked through mud. You were addressed by castle guards with a nod. You had a seat, even if it was in the back, at feasts lit by 100 candles. And if the food didn't run out, you might even get a bite. Your name wasn't shouted, it was whispered. That's the one who works for the prince. She holds the queen's jewelry. He polishes the royal armor. You weren't noble, but you weren't invisible either. You were part of the scene, part of the ritual, the ceremony, the display of power. From the outside, you looked important. And that was the trick. Because none of it was really yours. The silk you wore? Borrowed. The ring you held? Not yours. The crown you carried on a velvet pillow? You weren't even allowed to look directly at it, much less touch it without gloves. You walked behind power but never beside it. You moved through luxury without belonging to it. You were close to royalty the way candle wax is close to flame. Useful, decorative, and always in danger of melting. Still, outsiders envied you. Look at him, they said. He's in the castle. Must be doing well. They didn't see the bruises on your knees from hours spent scrubbing floors that were already clean. They didn't see you shivering in a linen shift outside the chamber door at 3 a.m. because the princess might want hot wine and someone had to be there. They didn't know your shift started before dawn and didn't end until someone important said, "You may go," and sometimes they forgot to say it. But you smiled, always, because smiling was part of the uniform. You bowed just right, curtsied just low enough. You spoke only when spoken to, and even then, your words were soft, agreeable, and never too clever. Cleverness was dangerous. You were there to serve, not to shine. Occasionally, you were rewarded. A glance from the king, a coin, a leftover pastry. Once, someone said thank you. You carried that like a medal. You told no one, but it was something. Because in a world built on power, proximity could feel like privilege. And sometimes, for a moment, it was. A warm robe placed on your shoulders during a winter watch. A laugh from a duchess when you told a joke you weren't supposed to tell. A soft pillow, just once, in the steward's room because the prince was away. Small things, fleeting things. But in the castle, even scraps of comfort felt like miracles. You were in the palace, yes, but don't let the walls fool you. You weren't powerful, you were convenient. In the great pyramid of medieval power, you were somewhere between decorative furniture and replaceable distraction. The king made decisions, the queen held influence, the nobles had titles, the guards had swords. You? You had a mop, or a tray, or a schedule memorized down to the minute, not your own, of course, but theirs. The closer you were to the throne, the lower your freedom dropped. Nobles had choices, servants had tasks. If the prince sneezed, someone had to run for herbs. If the duchess lost a glove, someone had to search the stables. And if the queen changed her mind about the wine, well, you hoped your legs were ready. You weren't family. You weren't even staff in the way we think of it now. You were more like a shadow that had duties. Always there, never noticed, unless you messed up. And when you did, people noticed very quickly, loudly, and sometimes with thrown objects. There was no seat at the table for you. You stood behind the chair. You weren't part of the plan. You were part of the polish, the shine that made royalty look smooth and effortless. You made their lives appear magical, even if it meant yours never was. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't walk in front of nobles. You didn't touch the curtains unless you were told. You didn't yawn, cough, or blink too long. If you entered a room and forgot to bow, that wasn't awkward. It was disrespect. And disrespect had consequences. Always downward, never up. Even within the servant ranks, there were invisible hierarchies. The steward outranked the page. The chambermaid outranked the scullery girl. And someone always outranked you. It was a ladder. But you didn't climb it. You held it in place while others stepped on your back. You were needed, but not valued. Present, but not counted. Part of the mechanism, but never in control. And when the day ended, if it ever did, no one asked how you were, because that wasn't your place. You weren't important enough to ask, only important enough to blame. Living in a medieval palace meant living under constant observation. Not the kind you could see, like a stern guard at the door, but the kind you felt, like heat, like pressure, like silence just before someone says your name the wrong way. You were never alone, and never unwatched. Every hallway had eyes. Some were noble, some were hired. Most were simply bored. Servants watching servants, pages watching maids, maids whispering about footmen. Everyone watching everyone else, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. If something went wrong, the person who saw something usually avoided punishment. The person who didn't often became the example. One misplaced glance could mean you were improper. One step too close to a noble, and you were ambitious. One whisper in the wrong corridor, and you were a spy. None of it needed to be true, only useful. You walked softly, not just out of courtesy, but because footsteps echoed, and echoes were remembered. You kept your voice low, not out of humility, but because walls heard better than people. You learned not to look too long at anyone, especially not someone important. Eye contact wasn't respect, it was challenge, and you weren't there to challenge anyone. There were rules, spoken, unspoken, occasionally invented on the spot. How you bowed, how you held a goblet, when you backed away and how far. Whether your silence was seen as reverence or insult, it changed daily, and somehow you were expected to know. Gossip was deadly. Not to nobles, they thrived on it, but to you. A rumor could kill you faster than infection. He spoke to the wrong chambermaid. She stayed too long near the prince's door. He asked a question. That one was especially dangerous. Questions meant curiosity, and curiosity meant you weren't satisfied with your place, which meant someone might need to remind you what your place was. So, you smiled, you nodded, you agreed, even when you didn't understand, especially then. Every room was a stage, every day was a performance, and the audience wasn't cheering, they were waiting. Waiting for you to slip. Not because they hated you, but because they feared being noticed more than you. And in a palace built on blame, someone always had to fall first. You just tried very hard to make sure it wasn't you. Your job wasn't grand. It wasn't glorious. It was small, specific, often repetitive, and it had to be perfect. You weren't building cathedrals. You were folding cloaks, lighting candles, polishing a chair leg until it reflected the crown that never touched it. Tasks so minor, most people wouldn't notice if they were done wrong. Except in a castle, someone always noticed, and they noticed loudly. You poured tea, not just warm, but the right warmth. Too hot, disrespect. Too cold, laziness. You tied shoelaces, not just tight, but symmetrical. One bow drooping, and suddenly, you lacked discipline. You placed a cloak over royal shoulders, not a second too early, not a second too late, and never, ever let it touch the floor. You cleaned, not for hygiene, but for status. Dust wasn't just dirt, it was shame. A single fingerprint on a goblet meant someone had failed their lineage, that someone was probably you. Even gestures were measured. How you handed a letter, how you opened a curtain, how long you stood still before being dismissed. Standing too long? Impolite. Leaving too soon? Arrogant. So you waited, and waited, because patience was the only power you were allowed to display. There was no applause, only the absence of punishment. That was success. And if something went wrong, the chain of blame was fast and unforgiving. The candle burned too low. You should have replaced it. The cushion was lumpy. You should have fluffed it. The prince tripped over his robe. You should have seen the future and fixed it before it happened. You weren't thanked. You weren't even acknowledged most days. But you were expected to know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it better than last time, even if no one told you how the first time. And then there were the ceremonial tasks. Holding a bowl during a royal washing, carrying the wine in state banquets, standing behind a noble during a silent vigil, not moving, not breathing too loudly, not scratching your nose even if it itched for hours. Discipline wasn't optional. It was your currency. You didn't have power. You had precision. You didn't have glory. You had a job description written in silence and upheld through fear. Your work was invisible until it wasn't. And the moment it wasn't, it had better be flawless. Because in the palace, mistakes weren't errors. They were offences. And offences had consequences. Life in the castle didn't run on your schedule. It ran on theirs. The royals woke up. So did you. They stayed up late. So did you. They felt restless at midnight and wanted a stroll with lanterns and warm honeyed wine. You were already halfway down the hallway, fetching both. Your day began before the sun, and it didn't end. It just paused briefly when no one was looking. There were no shifts, no rotations, no polite schedules pinned to the wall with break times marked in cheerful ink. You didn't ask, "When's my day off?" You asked, "Will I sit today?" Most days, the answer was no. You ate when there were scraps. You slept when someone forgot to need you. And even then, you stayed half awake, just in case the princess dropped her ring down a drain again or the duke decided he liked his shoes cleaned at dawn. You weren't allowed to be tired. Tiredness was seen as weakness. And weakness meant someone younger, faster, quieter might replace you. So, you smiled through it. Through the aching knees, the blurred vision, the calloused hands, the ringing in your ears from standing too long beneath the cathedral bells during morning mass. Pain wasn't something you spoke of. It was something you folded into your posture and carried with grace. If you limped, someone would ask if you were slowing down. If you sneezed, someone would suggest you avoid the royal wing permanently. Colds were contagious, but so was perception. And being seen as a burden was worse than being sick. There were no complaints, not because nothing hurt, but because complaints had nowhere to go. They rose from your throat and turned to silence before they reached the air. You learned to endure, to hold the tray steady, even when your arms trembled, to stand straight, even when your back begged otherwise, to answer, "I'm fine," even when you forgot what fine meant. And when you did have a moment, a few breaths in the laundry room, a blink of quiet by the window, you didn't exhale relief. You listened, because quiet often meant someone was about to need you. Or worse, about to notice you'd stopped moving. So you moved, always, until motion became habit, until stillness felt dangerous. Because in the castle, rest wasn't granted. It was stolen, in whispers, in fragments, and only ever borrowed. Castles weren't just made of stone and gold. They were built from secrets, stacked, polished, and sealed behind every velvet curtain and carved doorframe. And if you worked inside one, you were part of the structure, whether you meant to be or not. You knew things, not because you were curious, but because you were nearby. You walked halls where voices carried. You poured wine into cups that paused just before someone revealed too much. You cleaned the corners of rooms that still echoed with whispered threats. And you listened, not by choice, but because silence in the palace was rarely silent. You weren't trusted, but you were used. A noble might slip you a folded note. "Take this to the kitchen. Only the cook must see it." Another might smile too sweetly. "Tell no one the prince was here last night." Sometimes it was harmless. A love affair. A bad joke. Other times, it wasn't. Other times, the note wasn't for the cook, and the prince shouldn't have been there. And suddenly, your name was being spoken by people who shouldn't know it. You didn't know whose side you were on, because there were no sides, just shifting sands. What was loyal one week was treason the next. What was a secret today might be shouted in the throne room tomorrow. And when that happened, someone had to take the fall. Often, It was the servant who must have known. Information passed through you like wind through shutters. You weren't meant to hold it, only to let it pass. But even that was dangerous. Because if someone accused you of keeping secrets, the burden wasn't proof. It was suspicion. And in the medieval court, suspicion was heavy enough to drown you. You couldn't repeat what you heard. You couldn't react to what you saw. Your best chance at survival was selective deafness and an impressively blank stare. Even then, you might be summoned. Did you hear anything last night? Did anyone visit the West Wing? Did Lady Helena seem strange? And what did you say? Nothing helpful. Nothing risky. You shrugged. You bowed. You looked confused. You pretended the words you carried in your head didn't exist. Because if you knew too much, you were a threat. But if you knew nothing, you were useless. And useless things, in a castle full of sharp minds and sharper blades, were often removed. In the medieval court, power never died quietly. It shifted, loudly, suddenly, and usually with collateral damage. And if you were standing too close when the tide turned, congratulations. You were now collateral. Loyalty was admired, until it became inconvenient. If the duke you served fell out of favour, so did everyone who fetched his wine. If the queen's cousin got caught in a scandal, her handmaidens were investigated. And if a noble lost a war of whispers, someone had to answer questions publicly, preferably someone no one would miss. That was you. You didn't attend council meetings. You didn't sign decrees. But you carried messages. You opened doors. You lit candles for private talks that weren't supposed to happen. And that was enough. Enough to make you suspect. Enough to make you expendable. You became a symbol, not of guilt, but of convenience. Because when politics turned sour, it helped to punish someone easy, someone without a title, someone who wouldn't spark rebellion if they vanished, someone like a servant. They called it discipline, precaution, protecting the realm. But what it really was theatre, a public scolding, a quiet removal, a lesson to others. Stay in line, or else. You might be dragged into court, not for justice, but for appearances. You'd be asked questions with no right answers. Did you see Lord Hawthorne enter the chamber? If you said yes, you were complicit. If you said no, you were lying. If you hesitated, well, guilty men hesitate. Sometimes you were punished for what you knew, other times for what you didn't, often just for being present. And no one protected you. The noble you served might say, "I don't recall that servant." The lady whose secrets you kept might suddenly forget your name. The master you followed for 10 years might nod solemnly and suggest that perhaps you were acting alone. Because in the palace, memory was flexible, especially when it served survival, and survival always flowed upward. So you learned, slowly, that being loyal didn't mean being safe, that being useful didn't mean being valued, that sometimes the blade fell not on the traitor, but on the witness. And when it did, it wasn't personal, it was politics. You were the shield they held up, just long enough to block the arrow. Royal courts didn't run on logic, they ran on protocol. Not law as we know it, but something older, stranger, a mix of tradition, pride, and mood. And if you were a servant, that meant you lived inside a maze of invisible tripwires, none of which you were allowed to question. You could be punished for anything. For speaking too soon, for speaking too late, for standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, for walking too fast in the presence of a noble with delicate nerves, for not laughing at a joke, for laughing too loudly, for forgetting the name of the king's hunting dog. There were rules for how you bowed, how deep, how long, rules for how you passed a goblet, which hand, what angle, even how low your head should be while doing it. And here's the fun part. These rules weren't written down. You learned them by watching, by guessing, and by occasionally being punished when you guessed wrong. The queen frowned when you lit the wrong candles. That was your lesson. The steward scolded you for placing flowers that clashed with the tapestry. That was your exam. The prince threw a pear at your head because you used the wrong spoon for stew. Consider that extra credit. Punishments were rarely fair, often creative. A scullery maid once mopped the wrong hallway and was assigned to scrub chamber pots for a week. A stable boy forgot to bow and ended up cleaning armor with vinegar for 3 days. One servant used the wrong honorific and was publicly slapped by a visiting duke in front of guests, with music playing. There was no appeal, no explanation, no, "I didn't know," because not knowing was the problem. Ignorance wasn't excused. It was offensive. It meant you weren't trying hard enough, weren't paying attention, weren't worthy of proximity to greatness. Even silence could betray you. If a noble tripped and you didn't react the right way, not too alarmed, not too amused, it could be seen as mockery, or worse, satisfaction. You walked on a tightrope woven from etiquette and ego, every step a risk, and you did it with your head down, hoping no one noticed your shoelace was untied. Because in the castle, punishment wasn't about justice, it was about reminders that you were there to serve, and to suffer, quietly, elegantly, and without asking why. If you thought working in a castle meant you had a little corner to yourself, a room, a bed, maybe just a locked chest for your things, you thought wrong. Privacy was not part of the deal, not for you. Not ever. You lived where space allowed, which usually meant a shared loft above the kitchen, or a drafty storeroom with 5 other servants and exactly 1 blanket that didn't smell like boiled turnips. You didn't have a bed. You had a surface. If you were lucky, it wasn't already claimed by someone snoring louder than the chapel bells. Your possessions? Few, and not really yours. A comb, a second pair of socks if you were rich, maybe a wooden charm someone carved you last summer. And they all fit in a pouch you kept tied to your waist, because if you left it unattended, it wouldn't be there long. Even your thoughts weren't private. You learned early that someone was always listening. Not official spies, just bored people with ears. Other servants, passing nobles, wandering guards. You whispered? That whisper might turn up at court tomorrow, slightly exaggerated and wildly misinterpreted. You couldn't write things down. Letters were risky. Journals, if discovered, were worse. Why were you keeping secrets? What did you mean by, "the lady looked pale"? Were you mocking her? Planning something? Recording things you shouldn't know? So you said less, thought quietly, memorized things and let them fade. Even your body wasn't your own. You were expected to appear tidy, presentable, modest, but not slovenly. No visible bruises unless they came from accidents. No illness unless someone else announced it first. If you coughed too much, someone might assume you were contagious, or worse, weak. You didn't choose when to sleep, or when to eat. You slept when others slept, ate when someone told you to, bathed if there was water left, changed clothes when someone handed you something clean, or something slightly less dirty. There were no doors you could close behind you, only curtains, thin ones, and even those could be pulled back without knocking. The palace didn't see you as a person with space. It saw you as part of the function, like a broom, like a candlestick, something that needed to be there, but only when needed. And when not needed, you simply faded, into corners, into silence, into the background where no one could find you because no one thought to look. Because in the castle, privacy wasn't a right. It was a luxury you didn't rate. You didn't lose yourself in the palace all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, like dust collecting in corners no one ever swept, until one day you looked up and didn't quite recognize the person bowing. At first, you told yourself it was just discipline, good posture, proper manners. You spoke less, because that was expected. You smiled politely, even when the smile wasn't real. You curtsied when told. You apologized for things that weren't your fault. It was just training, you thought, just part of the job. But over time, the performance became the personality. You flinched less when shouted at, not because it hurt less, but because flinching got you noticed. You stopped laughing in your throat, even when something was funny, because laughter echoed. And echoes traveled. You started asking fewer questions, not because you had the answers, but because curiosity looked dangerous on your face. You didn't daydream. You didn't pause too long in corridors. You didn't sigh, even when your body begged for rest. You became smaller, not physically but emotionally. You stopped remembering what your favorite meal was, what you used to wear, what you used to say when no one was listening. You didn't miss home, because home had become a rumor. Even your name softened. Some nobles didn't use it. They said boy or you, and after a while you responded faster to those than to your own. and you told yourself it was fine, because admitting otherwise was dangerous. You learned to kneel without shame, to be ignored without resentment, to serve people who didn't notice you, while pretending you didn't notice that either. And when someone tossed you a compliment, a real one, like "well done," or "that will be all," it landed like gold in an empty purse. The worst part? You began to measure your worth through their eyes. You felt proud when they nodded, ashamed when they frowned. You stopped asking whether they deserved your loyalty. You just hoped they noticed you enough to remember not to hurt you. In a place where masks were mandatory and silence was praised, it made sense that you'd eventually forget who you were under all of it. Not all at once, just a little more each day. Until one morning, you looked in the mirror, and the person tying the laces, bowing just right, adjusting the collar again and again, wasn't pretending anymore. That was simply who you'd become. The palace was never quiet. Footsteps echoed. Laughter rose and fell like music in a feast. Dishes clinked. Horses whinnied in distant courtyards. Doors opened and closed in endless rhythms. Servants moved in streams. Nobles glided through halls as if the air parted just for them. It was full, always full. And yet, you were completely alone. You shared spaces with people, but not moments. You passed faces, familiar ones, without speaking. You worked beside others, but rarely heard their thoughts. Conversations were whispers. Glances were warnings. Smiles? Mostly rehearsed. You weren't encouraged to bond. Friendship between servants was discouraged. It distracted. It created alliances. It suggested you had something, or someone, outside of your duty. So you became polite, pleasant, but never close. You ate beside people without knowing their last names. You handed off tasks in silence. Sometimes you noticed a new face. Sometimes you realized one was missing, but no one asked why. People came and went. Quietly, like candles blown out in an open hall. Even among nobles, you weren't part of the scene. You stood behind them, beside them, near them, but never with them. They rarely spoke to you unless they had a need. You weren't meant to respond beyond, "Yes, my lord," or "As you wish, milady." And when they laughed together, shared gossip, danced at feasts, you watched. Just enough to stay alert. Never enough to feel included. Even in celebration, you worked. Even in mourning, you waited by the wall. There were no arms around your shoulders, no shared tears behind tapestries, no warm voices asking, "Are you all right?" Because you weren't meant to be seen like that, as someone who felt things. You learned to carry your feelings folded up, tucked into sleeves, pressed behind your eyes. You learned to nod when you wanted to cry, to stay still when you wanted to run, and to walk away when someone you once cared for was punished, disappeared, or simply broken in a way no one acknowledged. Because in the palace, emotions weren't currency, they were weakness. And weakness was noted. So you kept your heart quiet, surrounded by silk, by music, by golden chandeliers and endless chatter. You played your part, flawlessly, in a grand and glittering performance, knowing all the while that no one would clap for you. Because in a place so full of people, your loneliness could hide in plain sight. From the outside, your life looked enviable. You walked through marble halls. You lit candles in rooms with ceilings taller than most village houses. You helped unpack gowns worth more than a blacksmith's home. You laid out jewelry that could buy a farm, and held cloaks lined with fox fur while the wind howled just outside the stone. People assumed you were fortunate, and in some ways, you were. You ate food most commoners never saw. Scraps, yes, but from gilded trays. You touched fabrics woven in foreign lands. You stood inches from power, from beauty, from history. You knew the faces behind the portraits. You knew which royals snored, which nobles lied, which lords couldn't remember your name no matter how many times you bowed. But none of it was yours. The silk you held belonged to someone else. The boots you polished would never touch your feet. The cushion you fluffed was not for your rest. Even your own uniform, neat, pressed, embroidered with the house crest, wasn't yours. It was issued. And when you left, it stayed behind, cleaned, reassigned, erased. You slept where space allowed. You shared beds, shared shelves, shared silence. No locked chest, no privacy, no room to decorate. The only thing that truly belonged to you was your body, and even that, you surrendered by the hour. You couldn't afford anything in the world you moved through. Not the wine, not the books, not the music lessons you overheard, not the polished shoes or the carved combs, or the little trinkets nobles tossed aside as meaningless. A misplaced ring to them was a year's earnings to you. And yet, from the outside, you looked elevated. Villagers envied your job. Strangers admired your posture. Merchants offered you discounts, thinking you might whisper a word to someone powerful. They didn't know you had no voice to lend. Because in the palace, your presence was mistaken for privilege. But it was only proximity. You were close to wealth, close to luxury, close enough to feel its warmth and its weight. But you didn't hold it. You carried it, cleaned it, arranged it on polished trays, and then stepped aside. Because in the end, you lived among riches, without ever owning a single thing. Working in a royal court didn't come with hazard pay. There were no healers on standby just for you, no scented oils to ward off disease, no quiet room to rest when your lungs burned or your skin broke into rashes. You worked through it, unless you couldn't. And if you couldn't, someone else took your spot, usually before the candle burned halfway down. Illness was everywhere. Not dramatic plague, though that came too, but slow, creeping sickness. A cough that wouldn't stop. A rash from chamber pot fumes. A wound that festered under bandages. No one had time to change. You shared beds, buckets, spoons. You breathed each other's air. One servant's fever became 5 within a week. No one noticed until you collapsed. And even then, they asked who could replace you. You were also surrounded by danger you weren't allowed to acknowledge. Slippery floors scrubbed too well. Candles placed too close to heavy drapes. Cellars with uneven steps. Towers with railings that wobbled, or simply ended. You carried trays up those stairs with one hand, the other holding your balance and your breath. You didn't complain. That wasn't the custom. You learned to recognize the sounds of someone falling, not because it happened once, but because it happened often. A scream, then silence. A crash, then whispers, followed by someone sweeping the corridor before the nobles noticed. Sometimes, death came not from injury or illness, but from absurdity. One servant wore the wrong-coloured sash and was mistaken for an intruder. Another was assigned to taste-test wine and didn't wake up. One girl walked too close to the hounds and got mauled, blamed for startling them. A boy was sent into the cold to watch for guests and never returned. He'd frozen beside the gate, still holding the bell. You weren't protected. You were exposed. To disease, to weather, to nobles in bad moods and guards with fast reflexes. And when someone died, unexpectedly, inconveniently, their name was whispered for a day, maybe 2, then reassigned. That was the part no one told you. That your life could end not in war or glory or even meaning, but in silence, in routine, in a hallway no one remembered. A slip, a cough, a noble's careless shout, and then nothing. Just another servant gone, and supper still needs serving. There was no quitting. Not officially, not politely, not with a handshake and a letter of thanks. You didn't give notice. You didn't pack a bag. You didn't announce, "I'm moving on to something less fatal," because you weren't supposed to want that, and wanting it was already suspicious. Service wasn't seen as employment. It was seen as placement. You were placed here, by birth, by debt, by obligation, and once you were in, leaving meant abandoning duty. Abandoning duty meant disloyalty, and disloyalty had consequences. You couldn't say, "I'm tired." Everyone was tired. You couldn't say, "I'm unwell." That sounded like weakness. You couldn't say, "I want to go home," because no one cared where that was, or if it still existed. So you stayed. Some tried to leave. They ran, quietly, in the early hours, disguised in cloaks that didn't fit, holding food they weren't allowed to take. Most were caught. A few were forgiven. Fewer survived the punishment, branded, beaten, sent to work in colder, darker places where questions weren't asked, only orders given. Others tried a different way. They asked for reassignment. They feigned injury. They tried to age themselves out of the role by stooping, coughing, exaggerating how slow they'd become. It rarely worked, Because if you were still breathing, you were still useful. And if you weren't useful here, you were useful elsewhere. The kitchens, the stables, the laundry pits, the latrine trenches. Down, not out. Moved, not freed. There were no pensions, no end-of-service banquets, no small cottage waiting by the woods where you could plant herbs and pretend you were never a shadow in a royal hallway. Even retirement, when it came, wasn't peace. It was suspicion. Why is he still here? What does she know? Why hasn't he left town? Because leaving meant you had seen too much, heard too much, knew too many names, too many doors, too many things that only mattered when someone powerful needed them erased. So the only acceptable exit was silence. You faded, disappeared, replaced. And when someone asked where you'd gone, the answer was simple. Someone new started yesterday. No one asked what happened to the old. Because in a system where loyalty was survival and invisibility was safety, the cleanest end was the one no one remembered. From the outside, being close to power seemed like a gift. You stood behind kings. You heard secrets before the court did. You held the cloak before the crown sat. You saw maps before battles, letters before weddings, tears before funerals. You weren't just part of the palace, you were part of its pulse. But power doesn't warm, it burns. Standing near it was like standing beside a forge, hot, bright, and loud. You didn't control the flame, you just endured the heat. The closer you were, the more it singed your skin. The more it blistered your judgment. You were near the decision-making but never invited in. You delivered messages but never spoke your own. You heard strategies, betrayals, alliances forming over spilled wine, and were expected to forget all of it by morning. You saw nobles rise and fall overnight. 1 minute, someone laughed in the garden. The next, they were gone, executed, exiled, forgotten. And with them went everyone who stood too close. Their servants, scribes, the boy who once fetched their boots. Proximity meant risk. You could be mistaken for an accomplice, or a witness, or just too aware. And when power shifted, as it often did, it looked for someone to blame. Someone close, someone small, someone quiet. Like you. You couldn't share what you knew. You couldn't protect who you liked. You couldn't act on the instincts power sharpened inside you. Caution, observation, understanding, because all of those looked too much like strategy, and strategy was reserved for those with titles. All you could do was obey, and hope the heat didn't catch you next. You learned not to ask, not to advise, not to comfort. You learned to nod in moments of cruelty, to smile during injustice, to hold the door open for someone you knew would not survive the week. Because surviving the palace wasn't about strength, it was about stillness. About knowing when to move, when not to look, when to seem useful but never threatening, present but never remembered, trusted but never truly known. And so you stood there, near the throne, near the torches, near the roaring center of a machine that never stopped. It gleamed, it dazzled, it consumed, and when it was done, it did not thank you. It simply turned to the next pair of hands. So now you know. Serving royalty in the Middle Ages wasn't a story of honor, elegance, or quiet prestige. It was a life spent walking beside power without ever touching it, a performance without applause, a burden carried in silence. You looked the part, polished shoes, bowed head, steady hands. You stood in halls of gold, near people with names carved into history, but you were never meant to be remembered. You were meant to be invisible, reliable, replaceable. You endured long hours, impossible rules, shifting loyalties. You watched others rise and fall, sometimes in seconds. You swallowed questions, wore smiles, and buried parts of yourself so deeply that even you stopped looking for them. And when your time came, through dismissal, accident, illness, or the simple decision of someone above, you vanished. No farewell, no monument, maybe a nod. Maybe a new servant in your place by evening. History doesn't write about people like you. But that's the point. Because the palace only functions if someone keeps the torches lit, the floors clean, the secrets intact. You weren't the voice. You were the silence that let the voice echo. You didn't change the world. You kept it running, quietly, in the background, until the end. And perhaps that was its own kind of legacy. Let's begin, not with action, but with silence. The kind of silence you only get when the world hasn't figured out how loud it's going to be yet. The 1500s were not a time of comfort. They were a time of sailing into nothingness, obeying men with maps that lied, and trusting stars that didn't care if you drowned. It was the golden age of exploration, or more honestly, the age of desperately trying to find things to conquer before someone else did. The oceans weren't highways. They were long, wet death sentences wrapped in optimism. Most voyages didn't end in discovery. They ended in scurvy, mutiny, or sinking just far enough offshore for people to forget your name. The ships were made of wood, soaked in tar, packed with bodies, and blessed, if you were lucky, with one toilet for 100 men. If you weren't lucky, and most weren't, you simply chose a corner of the deck, hoped for a wave, and tried not to fall overboard mid-process. No one bathed, no one smelled good. Food came in 3 categories: dry, mouldy, or moving. And water was something you started with, then ran out of, and then replaced with whatever alcohol didn't catch fire under the sun. This was a man's world, not in the proud, triumphant way the phrase is often used, in the exhausted, miserable, please don't make me do this again kind of way. Command belonged to men. Adventure belonged to men. Survival, most of the time, belonged to no one. Women were not there, at least not officially. You weren't supposed to be on ships. You weren't supposed to lead anything. You were supposed to stay home, raise heirs, and hope none of them caught the plague. The sea was no place for you, not because you weren't strong enough, but because the world didn't have room for stories where you were in charge. The explorers we remember, Magellan, Columbus, Drake, are all painted with the same brush, brave, sunburned, and vaguely heroic. But their ships were floating prisons, their crews were desperate, and their destinations were guesses. Many of these men had never even seen a map that showed what they were trying to find. They just set sail and prayed, or didn't. And then there was the colonial part, the not-so-small detail that these discoveries were mostly exercises in showing up where people already lived and claiming it anyway. To be a conquistador was to arrive with a sword in one hand, a Bible in the other, and a face that said, "Yes, I do think this is mine now." The age of exploration was also the age of erasure. And still, they kept sailing, because back home, life was no easier. There were wars, taxes, inquisitions, plagues, and winters that could freeze your soul solid. The sea was terrifying, but staying was worse. So men sailed and died. And sometimes, if they were very lucky or very cruel, they lived just long enough to make it into a book. But what if you were a woman? What if you stepped onto one of those ships, not as a stowaway, not as a servant, but as someone with power? What if you took the helm, gave the orders, faced down mutiny, disease, and death, and didn't flinch? That wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And her name was Isabel Barreto. She wasn't supposed to lead. She wasn't even supposed to be there. Isabel Barreto was born around the year 1567, in a world where birth decided everything: your gender, your class, your possibilities, and your limitations. Most women born into Spanish colonial society were expected to follow a path as narrow as a monastery hallway: marriage, motherhood, and maybe, if they were lucky, a few hours of embroidery before death. But Isabel's life, from the beginning, had other plans. She came from a noble family, which sounds nice until you realize that noble just meant you owed your life to the king instead of a landlord. Her family was Spanish, deeply Catholic, and well-connected enough that Isabel didn't spend her childhood starving. Instead, she spent it surrounded by silence. The kind of silence that trains you to sit properly, speak only when spoken to, and never, ever question why the map of the world had so few women's names on it. And yet, she listened. She listened to stories of conquest and sea routes, of empires unfolding like sails in the wind. She listened to men who hadn't even seen the ocean pretend they could command it. And when she married, she didn't just marry a man, she married a mission. Her husband was Alvaro de Mendaña, a well-known navigator, and one of those men who believed that if you simply sailed long enough in one direction, God would reward you with a new world. He was the kind of man who wore faith like armor and ambition like perfume. And Isabel? She went with him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That was unexpected. Women on ships were bad luck. That was the superstition. But Isabel didn't care. She boarded the ship anyway, embroidered gown, dagger in her boot, spine like a harpoon. She wasn't there to carry water. She wasn't there to sing hymns. She was there to witness history, and maybe, just maybe, to redirect it. People didn't know what to do with her. A woman on deck was unsettling. A woman with opinions, dangerous. But Isabel had always known how to walk the line between courtesy and command. She didn't shout. She didn't challenge. She watched, and when the moment came, she would be ready. Still, on paper, she was just the wife, the travelling companion, the quiet noblewoman with the well-practiced smile. She had no title, no official power, no reason to be respected. But titles don't always come before action, and respect doesn't always need permission. On calm days, she studied the stars. On stormy nights, she stood near the helm. People noticed, quietly, uneasily. There was something about her presence, unnatural, perhaps, or simply too natural in a space she wasn't supposed to belong to. Even the ocean seemed to pause when she passed. She wasn't supposed to be on that voyage. She wasn't supposed to read maps or issue commands or remember the names of the sick. But she did. And when things began to fall apart, as they always do when you mix wooden boats, tropical heat, and fragile egos, it wasn't Alvaro they looked to. Not anymore. The woman they thought was just decoration was watching, calculating, preparing. She hadn't come to be remembered. She had come to survive. And survival, in the 16th century, didn't care if you were male or female. It cared if you had the strength to keep going when everything around you fell into the sea. That strength had a name. And it was Isabel. The plan was simple. Sail west. Find the Solomon Islands. Claim them for Spain. Survive. That last part was the tricky one. It was 1595, and Alvaro de Mendaña, Isabel's husband, was determined to finish what he'd started years earlier, a mission to find the legendary Isles of Gold somewhere in the vast Pacific. He brought ships, soldiers, priests, ambition, and dysentery. Isabel brought herself. The fleet left Peru with high hopes and low provisions. 4 ships, hundreds of men, a few women, and an idea that somewhere across the water there was a paradise waiting to be discovered, tamed, and renamed. No one mentioned how long the voyage might take. No one wanted to talk about what would happen if it went wrong. But it did. First came the storms, the kind that don't just toss a ship, they peel it apart. Wooden beams howled, masts cracked. People prayed to gods they didn't believe in, or maybe believed in too late. Then came the heat, that slow-roasting, lung-thickening kind of heat that made sleep impossible and tempers short. Water turned sour, bread turned green, skin blistered. Salt stuck to every surface, including your tongue. And then came the sickness. It always comes. Scurvy, dysentery, fevers with no name. Men began to fall, first slowly, then all at once. They vomited, wept, cursed, and disappeared overboard. Not in ceremony, just in necessity. The smell had to go somewhere, and all the while, the ships drifted. Weeks blurred into months. Maps became suggestions. Morale dropped faster than the rations. Officers bickered. Sailors whispered. Someone stole food. Someone else tried to start a mutiny. There was no land in sight, just ocean and the growing sense that no one was coming to save them. And Isabel? She didn't flinch. She stayed by Alvaro's side, helped with orders, spoke to the sick, kept the crew moving, if not forward, then at least alive. She rationed supplies with brutal precision. She remembered who had eaten and who had lied about it. Her presence wasn't warm, but it was firm. In a world unravelling plank by plank, she held. Then came land. Or something like it. The Solomons, a scattering of islands, green and humid and already inhabited. The Spanish planted flags, built a camp, dug latrines. waited for the miracle of conquest. It didn't come. The islanders weren't welcoming. Why would they be? Foreigners had arrived, armed, desperate, and covered in disease. Tensions rose, skirmishes broke out, supplies dwindled. The ground refused to grow food. The air smelled like salt and failure. And then Alvaro died. Just like that. Fever, infection, exhaustion, gone. And with him went the last official authority. For a moment, the deck went quiet. The men looked around. No captain, no map, no hope, just hunger and the slow, crawling realization that they might not make it home. But one person moved. One person stepped forward. She wasn't appointed. She wasn't approved. But she was already in command. Isabel Barreto picked up the pieces. And the world would never forget. Though for a long time, it tried. Alvaro died quietly. Not in a blaze of glory, not in the middle of a heroic speech, just quietly. One day he was sweating. The next day he was murmuring something no one could understand. And the day after that, he was gone. His lungs gave up. His body caved in. His dreams of colonial conquest floated off like smoke. There was no grand funeral, no trumpet, no ceremony. Just a shallow grave dug into damp soil, a few rushed prayers, and men already whispering, "Who's in charge now?" No one had the answer, except Isabel. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't assemble a council or ask for votes. She simply began doing what no one else seemed ready to do, lead. It caught the crew off guard. She had been the wife, the noblewoman, the silent figure by the captain's side, but now she was giving orders, calmly, firmly, without blinking. Some men protested, loudly. They said a woman couldn't command a fleet. They said it wasn't legal. They said it wasn't natural. But Isabel didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply gave orders. And when one officer refused them, she had him bound, stripped of rank, and left behind, not as revenge, as a message. Leadership, she understood, isn't about being liked. It's about being obeyed, especially when the ship is rotting, the men are starving, and your maps are more guesswork than guidance. From that moment on, there were fewer arguments. Isabel rationed supplies with a cold precision. She charted their path with a steady hand. She recorded who was sick, who was faking it, who could work, and who couldn't be trusted. She wasn't warm, but she was alive, and in that moment, that was all the crew needed. The mood shifted, slowly, quietly. The same men who had mocked her presence now followed her gaze. No one cheered, no one thanked her, but they listened. Because survival wasn't democratic, and Isabel was surviving better than anyone. She walked the deck like it belonged to her, because now it did. She rewrote the role they had written for her. No longer the grieving widow, no longer the decoration, no longer the tolerated guest. She became Doña Isabel Barreto, Admiral of the South Seas. Not by title, by action. She didn't come to conquer. She came to endure. And endurance, on the open sea, was a kind of power no one else had managed to hold on to. There were no triumphs, no banners waving in the wind, but under her command, the crew kept moving. 1 mile, 1 ration, 1 bitter breath at a time. She didn't inspire songs, but she prevented collapse. She didn't ask for loyalty, but she earned fear. She wasn't trying to make history. She was trying to make landfall. And somewhere, deep down, every man on that ship knew, if they had any chance of seeing another port, it was because of her. She had stepped into a role no woman was meant to have, in a place no woman was meant to survive. And she didn't just fill the role, she redefined it. When Alvaro died, the command died with him. But Isabel? She rose. Not gently, not gracefully, but completely. And the sea, so used to swallowing men whole, held her up, just long enough for history to take notice. Then forget her. But not for long. There was no trumpet, no crown, no line of admirals welcoming her into their ranks. Just one woman, one fleet, and the kind of silence that means everyone is waiting for someone else to take charge, until you do. That's how Isabel Barreto became Admiral of the South Seas. Not by request, not by inheritance, by necessity. Her husband was dead. The chain of command, such as it was, had snapped. What remained was chaos, a stew of hunger, fear, heat, and men with no clear orders and too much free time. And into that void, Isabel stepped. Calm, measured, inevitable. There was resistance, of course. There's always resistance when a woman claims a role men think was built for them. Some officers whispered. Some grumbled. One attempted to contradict her in front of the crew. He was removed. Not with violence, not with drama, simply with clarity. He refused to follow her orders. So she gave him a new one. Pack up and get off her ship. And he did, because the sea has no time for debates. After that, the whispers got quieter. The grumbling didn't stop, but it got smarter, behind closed doors, in smaller groups, and with one eye, always watching her shadow. They called her cold, hard, unfeeling. She was, and she had to be. A fleet is not a family. It's a floating crisis. And every kind word spent soothing fragile egos is a word not spent fixing sails, counting rations, or plotting a course away from death. So she worked. Every hour, every day. She rationed food like a surgeon handles a knife. Precise, efficient, a little terrifying. She walked the deck with a list in her hand and a storm in her eyes. She kept track of supplies, injuries, morale, who lied, who broke, who might not make it through the week. She didn't inspire joy. She inspired motion. And that was enough. The fleet obeyed, not because they loved her, but because they didn't want to die. And Isabel? She didn't just want to live. She expected to. Even the ocean seemed to recognize that. Storms hit them, as storms do. Waves rose high enough to blot out the sky. Masts cracked. Sailors screamed. But somehow, the ships held. And when the skies cleared, Isabel was still standing, salt on her face, ledger in hand, already calculating what needed fixing. There were no medals, no songs, just survival. And survival, in that world, was sacred. By the time the fleet reached Manila, torn, battered, hungry, but alive, Isabel's command was no longer a controversy. It was a fact. She had kept them afloat. She had brought them home. And she had done it in a role no woman before her had held. Official records would later call her Doña Isabel Barreto, Admiral of the South Seas. But that title wasn't given. It was carved into the deck, into the wind, into the memories of every man who had followed her whether they wanted to or not. She didn't smile when they docked. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into waiting arms. She disembarked, took stock, and kept moving. Because the job wasn't about emotion. It was about results. She didn't command because it was symbolic. She commanded because no one else could do what she did. Because the sea doesn't reward symbolism. It rewards competence. And that's what she gave it. Every day, every storm, every moment when the entire world said, "You shouldn't be here." She stayed anyway. And the ocean for once let her pass. There's a special kind of chaos that exists only at sea. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's slow. It begins with silence, an extra second of hesitation when a command is given, a sideways glance between officers, a barrel of water that's somehow emptier than it should be, a whisper behind a mast, a knot tied incorrectly, on purpose. And if you don't catch it, if you let it grow, it becomes something else. Mutiny. Isabel Barreto understood this better than anyone. Because chaos doesn't shout. It simmers. So she didn't wait for the shouting. She led with precision, not charm, not inspiration. Discipline. Every morning began with inspection, not symbolic, practical. She walked the ship, checked supplies, noted faces. Who looked sick? Who looked angry? Who was missing? She knew that leadership wasn't about speeches. It was about knowing who hadn't eaten and who was lying about it. It was about noticing when the same sailor skipped duty 3 days in a row and when another stopped making eye contact. She didn't give warnings. She gave consequences. One officer refused to carry out her order, said it wasn't proper, said it wasn't Christian, said it wasn't his job to listen to a woman. She had him tied up, publicly, stripped of rank, rations cut, and left where everyone could see what happened when ideology collided with reality. Another man tried to stir dissent. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She reassigned him to latrine duty. For 2 weeks. No one complained after that. She was, by most accounts, merciless. But she wasn't cruel. Cruelty is personal. Isabel was practical. She didn't punish to prove a point. She punished to prevent collapse. Her leadership wasn't democratic. It wasn't flexible. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of leadership that gets people home. Which, ironically, was what everyone wanted. Even the men who resented her authority didn't want to die. And dying, under Isabel, was statistically less likely. She had rules. She enforced them, even when they were inconvenient. Especially when they were inconvenient. She understood something few leaders ever do. That fairness isn't always equal, and kindness isn't always helpful. That when the world is falling apart, people don't need comfort. They need certainty. And she was certain, in her decisions, in her silence, in her belief that hesitation was more dangerous than disease. She didn't micromanage. She delegated, trusted where she could, watched where she couldn't. Her leadership was like a knife, not decorative, not ceremonial, just sharp and always within reach. The ship didn't run on morale. It ran on fear, respect, and the quiet realization that this woman, this unexpected, unwelcome, unprecedented woman, was the only thing between them and oblivion. And even those who hated her knew. She saw everything. She remembered everything. And she forgot nothing. Isabel didn't inspire ballads. She didn't need to. Because when the sea rose up, when supplies ran low, when the air turned to rot and the sky turned to fire, she didn't flinch. She stood. And the crew followed. Not because she asked, but because she never once looked like she would fail. She was their admiral, not by affection, by function, and in a world built to erase her, she carved her authority into the bones of the ship itself. Firm, unyielding, and quietly undeniable, there's a kind of chaos that doesn't scream. It creeps. It doesn't start with rebellion. It starts with someone not tying the knot tight enough, a missing bucket, a skipped shift, an eye roll that lingers half a second too long. And at sea, where there's nowhere to go and no one to hide behind, that kind of chaos is fatal. Isabel Barreto saw it. All of it. Because while others prayed for land, or food, or mercy, she watched the little things. She always watched the little things. And when those little things started pointing toward collapse, she didn't hope for change. She enforced it. Her leadership wasn't loud. It didn't march or chant or pose for paintings. It moved like tidewater, relentless, necessary, and impossible to argue with. Every morning, she walked the deck. Not with a smile, not with questions, with a list. Who was sick? Who was late? Who wasn't pulling their weight? Who was muttering behind closed doors? She knew the names, the habits, the patterns. She knew how many biscuits were stolen, how many lies were told, and who was brave enough to think she didn't know. They called her harsh, cold, calculating. They were right. Because when the alternative is collapse, coldness is a gift. One man refused an order, said he wouldn't answer to a woman. She had him bound and reassigned to the worst duty imaginable, scraping the ship's latrines during high seas. Another tried to rally others to question her authority. He was transferred off the flagship. No warning, no explanation. Just a quiet disappearance and a tighter chain of command. There were no outbursts, no public speeches, just cause and effect. Obey, and things run. Disobey, and things stop. Simple math. She didn't punish out of emotion. She punished out of strategy. And she rewarded just enough to make obedience feel like a win. A biscuit here, an easier shift there, a nod, a name remembered. She wasn't trying to make friends. She was trying to keep men from killing each other, or themselves. And it worked. The ship didn't run on camaraderie. It ran on tension, respect, and the quiet dread that if you crossed her, you wouldn't get yelled at. You'd get replaced. That, more than anything, made her effective. Because the men didn't fear her temper. They feared her precision. She never made the same decision twice. Because no two problems were identical. She treated every breach of discipline like a unique threat. And she solved it like a tailor fits a suit, tightly, exactly, with no room to grow back. Her authority wasn't theoretical. It was absolute. And more importantly, it was earned. Not because she demanded it, but because the alternative was chaos. And chaos didn't feed you. It didn't navigate. It didn't stop you from drinking salt water or falling into madness. She did. Her hands stayed dry. But her mind never did. It stayed soaked in contingency plans, worst-case scenarios, and silent calculations no one else had the clarity or courage to make. She didn't inspire loyalty. She inspired structure. And structure, under her watch, held like iron. In the end, Isabel Barreto didn't command a fleet. She commanded the illusion of order in a world where the line between survival and collapse was measured in inches. And she never let that line slip. Not once. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not by law. Not by custom. Not by the soft, unwritten rules that shaped the 16th century like wind shapes cliffs, slowly, invisibly, and without mercy. A woman, in command, of ships, of men, of fear, of direction. It simply wasn't done. The sea, after all, was a man's domain. The maps were made by men. The ships were built by men. The orders, the punishments, the prayers screamed into salt air, all male voices. Women, when they were mentioned at all, were wives, stowaways, or warnings. A woman on board was said to bring bad luck, not because she did, but because people needed someone to blame when the sails ripped and the biscuits ran out. But Isabel Barreto didn't ask for permission to be on that ship. She didn't enter quietly, and she certainly didn't stay silent. She wasn't trying to break gender norms. She was trying to survive. And survival, as it turns out, doesn't care what you're allowed to do. It only cares what you're capable of. When the last man in charge fell, when disease or fear or the sheer weight of command broke him, Isabel stepped forward. Not like a mutiny. Like gravity. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply took the space that had been left behind. And once she stood there, no one else dared to move her. She didn't lead like a man. She didn't soften her edges. She didn't ask to be understood, or respected, or even tolerated. She led like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. And perhaps that's what made her most dangerous. Not her gender, but her certainty. Because men were used to being challenged by other men. They had protocols for that. Duels, debates, chains of command. But a woman who gave orders without flinching? Who punished disobedience without blinking? Who stared down a deck full of doubters and didn't explain herself? That wasn't just new. It was impossible. And yet, there she was, walking the planks of a ship no one expected her to survive, let alone command. Reading charts, cutting rations, breaking up fights, ending mutinies before they began. Not with violence, with presence. She became the center of the storm without ever raising her voice. The gravity around which the fleet reluctantly, then inevitably, began to orbit. Men followed her because disobedience was exhausting, and because, over time, they saw what she was doing, keeping them alive, not through divine favor, not through charm, through competence, pure, unsentimental, relentless competence. She didn't wear armor. She wore practicality. And in a world where women were supposed to be delicate, decorative, and deferential, Isabel was none of those things. She was direct. She was decisive. She was unshakable. And the ocean, it turns out, respects that more than any tradition ever written by men. History didn't know what to do with her, so it tried not to mention her, tried to file her under exception instead of example, because to say her name too loudly was to admit something uncomfortable. That gender isn't always destiny. That power doesn't always look like what you were taught to recognize. And that sometimes the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is not disappear, Isabel Barreto didn't campaign. She didn't philosophize. She just led, day after day, storm after storm, until the only thing left to argue with was the fact that she did it, and survived. At the helm of the ocean, she should have been remembered. Her name should have echoed through textbooks, carved onto plaques, painted into murals of great explorers and sea captains. There should have been statues, schools, stories passed down through generations. But there weren't, because Isabel Barreto did the one thing history rarely forgives. She succeeded in a role that wasn't meant for her. She survived where men failed. She led without apology. And then, she vanished. Not literally, but symbolically. She disappeared into the margins. A name, occasionally footnoted. A curiosity, an exception, rarely a subject. History remembered the voyage, the fleet, the hardships, the diseases. It remembered the men who dreamed of empires. It forgot the woman who kept the dream from drowning. It happens more often than people think, because history, at least the kind written in ink and marble, is selective. It elevates the conquerors. It celebrates the familiar. And when a story doesn't fit the pattern, it gets shelved. Quietly, permanently, Isabel's legacy became a whisper. She returned from the Pacific not in triumph, but in silence. No parades, no medals, no recognition from the crown, just survival. She had led a fleet across an ocean. She had enforced discipline, saved lives, finished what her husband could not. And then, like so many first women, she was expected to fade politely. But fading was never her style. Though her name was tucked away, her impact lingered. Not in the records, but in the tension her story created, because her very existence posed uncomfortable questions. What if she had been a man? Would her portrait hang beside other admirals? Would her tactics be studied? Her name spoken with reverence instead of surprise? And how many other women like her, commanding, surviving, resisting, were buried in footnotes, misnamed, misfiled, or completely erased? How many built bridges while someone else got the credit? How many stood at the helm, only to be cropped out of the painting? We don't know. And that's the point. For every Isabel Barreto who made it through the storm, there were dozens who didn't, not because they failed, but because they were never allowed to try. Their stories, if they were told at all, were told sideways, through the lens of their husbands, through the bias of the record keepers, through the gaps between lines. They were described as difficult, unusual, emotional, ambitious. Words that, when applied to men, meant leadership. When applied to women, meant trouble. But Isabel was not trouble. She was proof. Proof that strength isn't masculine. That command doesn't require a beard. That a woman with clarity, resolve, and discipline can outlast men with louder voices and looser hands. She wasn't looking for legacy. She was looking for land, for stability, for breath. And in that journey, one of hardship, rot, doubt, and salt, she carved out something bigger than glory. She carved out space. Space for us to question what leadership looks like, what stories we elevate, what names we forget. Isabel Barreto was the first recorded female admiral in history, and yet most people have never heard of her. But maybe that's changing. Maybe, by remembering her now, we light a candle for all the other names buried under centuries of dust. Maybe we say to them, quietly, finally, we see you, we hear you, you were there, and you mattered. Isabel Barreto didn't set out to make history. She set out to survive, to keep a fleet afloat, to make it through the storm. And somehow, in doing that, without fanfare, without permission, she became the first woman to command a royal fleet across the Pacific. She wasn't meant to lead, but she did. She wasn't meant to last, but she endured. Through sickness, starvation, resistance, and silence. And then, she was forgotten. Not because she failed, but because she didn't fit the story. History likes its heroes clean, male, and properly framed. Isabel was none of those things. She was sharp, precise, and utterly unwilling to be erased. So here she is again, spoken aloud, even if just for a moment. A name returned to the sea air, a face rising from the footnotes. She reminds us that the past is full of people we were never meant to remember, that leadership doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are the ones told in whispers. You wouldn't last a day in her boots. Most didn't, but Isabel did. And because of that, she sails with us still, quiet, unbending, unforgotten. Across generations and cultures, especially in many parts of Asia, the phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," was not just an old proverb, it was a guiding principle. In Vietnam, as in other societies shaped by Confucian values, corporal punishment was deeply embedded in family life. Parents believed that to love a child meant to shape them through discipline, and that discipline often took the form of physical punishment. A slap, a smack, a wooden stick, these were not seen as acts of violence, but as necessary expressions of care. Children, meanwhile, were expected to endure. Talking back was disrespectful, crying was weakness, silence was maturity. Entire generations grew up with the idea that being hit by a parent was not only normal, but somehow virtuous. If you were hit, it was because you deserved it. If you weren't, perhaps your parents didn't care enough. There is a peculiar psychology to this normalization. When something painful happens repeatedly within a system of trust, such as between child and parent, it creates a conflict that the mind tries to resolve. One way children cope is by internalizing the idea that the punishment is love. That way, the world still makes sense. The person you depend on still loves you. The pain must have purpose. But does it? The trouble is, this belief didn't stay in the past. Even today, you'll hear adults say things like, "I was beaten as a kid, and I turned out fine." Or, "It's not abuse if it's done out of love." The implication is that physical punishment, when delivered by someone who claims to care, is somehow exempt from scrutiny. That love justifies pain, that intention matters more than impact. But is that really true? Studies in child psychology and neuroscience have increasingly shown the long-term effects of corporal punishment. Even mild physical discipline can lead to increased anxiety, impaired emotional regulation, and distorted relationships with authority. When a child learns that pain can come from love, they grow up confused about both. They may grow fearful of affection, or worse, they may repeat the cycle, believing that inflicting pain is a form of care. Cultural defenses of corporal punishment often invoke tradition. This is how our parents did it. It's part of who we are. But tradition is not a moral shield. Not everything handed down from the past deserves to be preserved. Some traditions are simply inherited pain, disguised as wisdom. To be clear, discipline is important. Children need boundaries. They need structure. They need to learn cause and effect, right and wrong. But discipline is not the same as punishment. And punishment is not the same as violence. True discipline involves teaching. It involves modeling behavior. It requires time, patience, and emotional maturity. Physical punishment, by contrast, is often a shortcut, a reflex, a way for adults to assert control quickly, sometimes out of stress, sometimes out of frustration, and sometimes out of fear. And yet, it is children who bear the burden, children who can't fight back, who can't walk away, who often don't have the words to describe what they're feeling, just the ache of knowing something is wrong, even when everyone around them insists it's right. That ache doesn't go away. It grows. It shows up in therapy years later, in relationships, in self-doubt, in shame, sometimes in silence. Perhaps the most tragic part of this legacy is how invisible it becomes. In many families, corporal punishment is so normalized that it goes unspoken. Children don't report it because they don't even realize it's not supposed to happen. Adults don't question it because it happened to them too. And so the cycle continues, not out of malice, but out of habit, out of ignorance, out of fear of change. But love is not meant to hurt, and pain is not meant to teach. We are at a turning point, culturally and generationally. As more parents begin to reflect on how they were raised, many are asking better questions. What does it mean to raise a child with dignity? How can we discipline without damage? How can we break cycles without breaking relationships? The answers aren't simple, but they begin with honesty. And honesty begins by saying, clearly, what was once called love sometimes wasn't. It's late. The child is screaming. The food is cold. The house is a mess. The adult is exhausted, overworked, undersupported, overwhelmed. And in that fragile moment, something inside snaps. The voice rises. The hand lifts. A punishment is delivered. But was it really discipline? Or was it something else entirely? The difference between discipline and punishment is not just about action, it's about intent, awareness, and emotional state. But in the chaos of everyday life, that line becomes dangerously blurred. One moment, a parent believes they are teaching a lesson. The next, they are simply reacting to stress, to noise, to their own inattention. For many adults, parenting is not something they were taught, it's something they improvise. And when people are pushed to their emotional edge, especially in cultures that equate authority with control, violence can feel like clarity. A quick slap, a yell, a door slammed shut. It's fast. It's loud. It silences the child. And for a brief moment, it feels like order has returned. But order is not the same as understanding. Discipline, when done right, is calm, deliberate, and centered in care. It is rooted in the long-term goal of helping a child grow into someone thoughtful, kind, and emotionally aware. It teaches boundaries through consistency, not fear. It gives consequences, not revenge. Punishment, by contrast, is often emotional discharge. It is about the adult's state, not the child's behavior. It may come from love, but it is filtered through exhaustion, shame, impatience, or even inherited trauma. It is not about helping the child learn. It is about stopping a moment the adult can no longer tolerate. That's why the line is so thin. Because adults aren't always aware of what they're carrying. They bring their own unresolved wounds into parenthood. Their own childhood punishments, their own need for control, their own fear of failure. And when they haven't processed those things, they can project them onto their children, expecting perfection, obedience, silence. But children are not mirrors for adult frustration. They are not emotional punchbags for hard days. They are not responsible for the pain their parents never learned how to name. Still, many adults justify punishment under the banner of discipline. They say, it's for their own good. They have to learn. That's how I was raised. But these justifications often mask a deeper discomfort, the fear of losing control. When a child pushes back, talks back, or breaks a rule, it triggers something in the adult, not just annoyance, but a challenge to identity. If I can't control my child, what does that say about me as a parent? In those moments, punishment becomes a defense mechanism. It's not about the child learning, it's about the adult regaining authority. This is why punishment can feel so satisfying in the short term. It gives the illusion of power. It creates silence. But silence is not growth. Fear is not respect. Obedience is not understanding. The real danger is that punishment often teaches the wrong lessons. Children may learn to lie to avoid consequences. They may learn to fear their parents rather than trust them. They may learn that mistakes make them unlovable. Worse, they may grow up believing that love is conditional, that affection must be earned by perfection, that punishment is a form of love, and love a source of pain. But it doesn't have to be this way. The first step is awareness. Parents and caregivers must pause and ask themselves honestly, am I doing this to teach or to release my own emotions? Is this about the child or about me? That pause is powerful. It creates space. Space to choose a different path, to take a breath, to de-escalate, to connect rather than react, to speak rather than strike. True discipline takes more effort than punishment. It requires emotional maturity, patience, and self-awareness. It means being willing to do the harder thing, not for immediate obedience, but for long-term trust. It means holding power with your child, not over them. That's the quiet revolution of modern parenting. It's not about being soft. It's about being strong enough to stay calm, gentle enough to understand, wise enough to break the cycle. Because the line between discipline and punishment is not drawn by action alone. It is drawn in the heart. in the pause before we react, in the voice we choose to use, and in the kind of adult we decide to be. It's easy to spot a bruise, a red mark on the skin, a swollen cheek, a scrape on the leg. But the wounds we don't see, the ones carried inside a child's heart, those are the ones that last longest. When a child is hit, it's rarely just the physical pain that lingers. What cuts deeper is the confusion, the betrayal, the silence that follows, the feeling of being hurt by the very person they trust most. It's not just the sting of the slap. It's the sound of footsteps storming in. It's the voice that once sang lullabies now turned sharp and cold. It's the room that feels smaller, darker, unsafe. For some children, the pain fades within minutes, but the memory doesn't. They begin to watch more carefully. They flinch at raised voices. They hesitate before speaking. They stop asking questions. They become quieter, not because they've become wiser, but because they've become afraid. Fear becomes the new teacher, and fear is a poor educator. When we hit a child, we teach them to associate mistakes with shame. We show them that errors are dangerous, that curiosity is risky, that love can hurt. Instead of helping them understand what they did wrong, we teach them to hide, both their actions and their feelings. Over time, these moments pile up. A child might not remember the exact number of times they were punished, but they'll remember the atmosphere, the tension in the air, the feeling of walking on eggshells, the lack of safety. This is what psychologists refer to as invisible trauma. It doesn't always show up as rebellion. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, or people-pleasing, or anxiety, or silence. One of the most well-known studies in childhood trauma, the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, found a direct link between early abuse and a wide range of long-term effects: depression, chronic illness, substance abuse, difficulty forming relationships. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. And yet, so often, these children grow up and hear, "But you turned out fine. Everyone gets hit sometimes. You're still alive, aren't you?" As if survival equals healing. As if being silent means being unharmed. As if strength is measured by how well we suppress pain. But children don't need to toughen up. They need to be seen. They need to feel safe, emotionally, not just physically. They need to know they can make mistakes and still be loved. Because without that sense of safety, they build defenses instead. Walls, masks, a false smile to keep the peace, a hardened heart to keep from feeling too much. Some of these children grow into adults who no longer cry, not because they don't feel, but because they were taught that tears are weakness. Some grow into parents who say, "My child needs to be stronger than I was," and repeat the very cycle they once feared. And some carry the weight quietly their whole lives, never realizing where the anxiety began, where the loneliness took root, where the fear started calling itself normal. But none of this is inevitable. We can break the cycle. It starts with recognizing that no child deserves pain as a lesson, that discipline can exist without harm, that emotional scars are real, even when invisible. It means apologizing when we cross the line. It means asking, "How did that make you feel?" It means holding our own anger long enough to remember we are the adult in the room. Because every time we choose connection over control, we rewrite something in that child's heart. We tell them, "You're safe now. Your feelings matter. You don't have to be perfect to be loved." And that message, that soft, quiet truth, heals more than any punishment ever could. There are books on economics, manuals for machines, courses for business, cooking, even dog training. But for the most important job in the world, raising a human being, most people are left to figure it out on their own. Becoming a parent doesn't come with a guidebook. There's no universal checklist, no standardized emotional training. And yet, society expects perfection, that parents will automatically know what to do. That love is enough. That instinct will carry them through. But what if instinct was shaped by trauma? What if love came tangled with fear, or silence, or control? Many adults enter parenthood, still carrying the weight of how they were raised. For some, that includes memories of yelling, hitting, or being punished harshly. And even if they vowed never to repeat those patterns, when stress hits, When the child cries too long, talks back, or refuses to listen, they often reach for the only model they've ever known. The rod, the slap, the threat. Not because they're cruel, but because they're tired, because they're overwhelmed, because no one ever taught them another way. In moments of emotional fatigue, the brain seeks shortcuts. It wants fast results, immediate silence, control, and hitting provides that illusion. A child stops crying, stops talking, obeys. But obedience isn't understanding, and silence isn't peace. Many parents don't even realize they're punishing to manage their own emotions. They feel out of control, and so they try to control the child. They feel disrespected, and so they demand submission. But underneath, there is often a different feeling. Fear. Fear of failing. Fear of being judged. Fear that their child's behavior is a reflection of their worth. And that fear becomes anger. And that anger becomes action. It doesn't help that many cultures still romanticize parental authority. In places where the phrase, "parents are always right," is considered sacred, questioning a parent's behavior feels taboo. A child's voice is dismissed. A parent's apology is rare. Authority is mistaken for infallibility. But authority without self-awareness becomes danger. Because even the most well-meaning adult can hurt a child when they haven't learned how to manage their own wounds. And when society offers no support, no emotional education, no mental health resources, no space to talk honestly about the struggles of parenting, the rod becomes the default. Not because it's effective, but because it's familiar. It's easier to say, "because I said so," than to explain. Easier to raise your voice than to regulate your tone. Easier to strike than to pause and ask, "what's really going on here?" But easy is not the same as right. No one is born knowing how to guide a child through emotional storms. It's a skill, and like any skill, it takes time, tools, and practice. Yet many adults were never taught how to name their own feelings, let alone hold space for someone else's. So when their child melts down in tears, they freeze or explode. And in the absence of tools, they pick up the rod. Not because they're bad parents, but because they're unprepared. That's the hidden truth behind many punishments. They're not about the child's behavior, they're about the adult's internal state. But what if we reframed the question? What if instead of asking, "how do I make my child behave?" we asked, "what is my child feeling right now? What am I feeling? What do we both need in this moment?" That shift, from control to connection, can change everything. It opens the door to a new kind of parenting, one rooted not in domination, but in relationship, where love isn't expressed through power, but through presence, where mistakes are met not with shame, but with guidance. It also creates space for parents to be human, to say, "I don't know," to say, "I'm sorry," to say, "I'm still learning too." Because parenting isn't about perfection, it's about growth. And growth begins when we stop pretending we have all the answers and start seeking better ones. No one taught you how to be a parent, but you can still choose to become one with awareness. You can put down the rod and pick up the courage to parent differently. Some people think that if you don't hit your child, you're being too soft. That kindness equals weakness. That patience invites disobedience. That a child who isn't put in their place will become wild, ungrateful, or spoiled. This belief comes from a long tradition of fear-based parenting, where control is mistaken for respect, and obedience is seen as the ultimate goal. But here's a difficult truth. Obedience is easy to create, if all you want is silence. Fear can shut a child up. Pain can stop a behavior, but neither builds character. Education without compromise does not mean choosing between being firm or being gentle. It means refusing to compromise on dignity, on connection, on the belief that children are not problems to solve, but people to guide. You don't need to be harsh to be clear. You don't need to punish to teach. You don't need to hit to set boundaries. What you do need is consistency. And consistency is hard. It's much easier to scream than to stay present. It's easier to say, "because I said so," than to explain a rule. It's easier to react than to reflect. But the easiest path rarely leads to the best outcomes. Being a parent, or a teacher, or a guide, is not about maintaining power. It's about stewarding growth. It's about being the adult who models calm when the room is loud. The adult who shows how to apologize. The adult who can say no with love, and yes with wisdom. Let's be honest. Children will test limits. They will throw tantrums, slam doors, talk back, forget homework, spill water, and push buttons you didn't know you had. But these are not signs that something is broken. They are signs that something is growing. What children need is not someone to suppress their behavior with force. They need someone who can help them understand it. That's what uncompromising education truly means. To say no to violence. To say no to shaming. To say no to quick fixes that cost long-term trust. But to also say yes to structure. Yes to rules that are fair and explained. Yes to consequences that are logical, not emotional. Yes to boundaries that are both firm and kind. Being uncompromising in education is not about being rigid. It's about standing for something higher. It's about holding the line without crossing it. Let's look at what firmness without violence might actually look like. A child throws a toy in frustration. Instead of yelling, the adult calmly says, "You're upset, and that's okay, but throwing is not safe. Let's try again." A teenager breaks curfew. Instead of slapping or grounding for a month without conversation, the parent sits down and says, "Help me understand what happened, and let's agree on a consequence that makes sense." A toddler screams in the store. Instead of threats or bribes, the parent picks them up and whispers, "I know it's hard. Let's breathe together." These moments take more time, more patience, more emotional labor, but they teach what punishment never can: self-regulation, empathy, and trust. In fact, neuroscience supports this. Studies show that when children are met with calm, consistent boundaries, their brains develop stronger emotional resilience. They learn to manage frustration not through fear, but through modeling. They grow into adults who can pause before reacting, who can name their emotions, who can treat others with respect. That's the goal, isn't it? Not just raising obedient children, but raising thinking, feeling, responsible people. People who don't confuse love with power, who don't repeat cycles of violence in future families, who can be both kind and strong. Let's be clear, saying no to hitting doesn't mean saying yes to chaos. It means saying yes to a different kind of strength, a strength that doesn't need to dominate to be respected, a strength that sees children not as small soldiers to command, but as full humans in development. This kind of parenting, this kind of teaching, it's not easy. It takes everything you have, and then some. It requires you to grow alongside your child, to confront your own wounds, to learn new skills your own parents may have never shown you. But it's worth it, because every moment you choose connection over control, you teach your child that love doesn't have to hurt. That authority can exist without fear. That discipline can be powerful, without being violent. Uncompromising education doesn't mean choosing between being strict or being soft. It means being wise enough to do both, firm enough to hold the line, humble enough to listen, and human enough to love without conditions. A child misbehaves. They scream, cry, slam doors, throw things, talk back. And somewhere in the adult's mind, a thought flashes. They need to be taught a lesson. They need to know who's in charge. They need discipline. But what if we asked a different question? Not what they deserve, but what they need. Not how to control, but how to connect. Because often, beneath every tantrum, every outburst, every act of defiance, is a feeling that's too big for a small heart to hold. Fear, frustration, loneliness, sadness. And no beating in the world can make that feeling go away. What children need more than a beating is understanding. They need someone who looks beyond the behavior and sees the need. They need someone who pauses before reacting. Someone who asks, "What's really going on inside you right now?" Because behind every bad behavior is a story the child doesn't yet know how to tell. Maybe they had a hard day at school. Maybe they feel ignored. Maybe they're tired, or hungry, or overwhelmed by emotions they don't have words for. In those moments, a beating only adds fear to the storm. It silences the child, but it doesn't solve the problem. It teaches them to hide, not to heal. So what do children truly need? They need safety. Emotional safety. The kind that says, even when you mess up, I'm here. The kind of safety that allows them to show their full selves, joyful, angry, messy, confused, without fear of being hurt. They need guidance, not punishment. They need someone who will kneel down, look them in the eye, and say, that wasn't okay, but you're not a bad child. Let's talk about what happened. That's how they learn accountability, not through fear, but through conversation. They need consistency, not rules that change with the adult's mood, not love that disappears when they disobey. They need to know what's expected, and that the boundaries come from care, not control. They need presence, not just physically, but emotionally. A parent who truly listens, not while scrolling a phone or rushing to finish a task, but who listens with the heart. Who gives them space to speak, even if what they say is messy or inconvenient. They need empathy. Someone who remembers what it's like to be small, to feel powerless, to be misunderstood. Someone who doesn't say, I'm the adult, I know better, but who says, I remember feeling that way too. And most of all, they need love. Not love that's earned through obedience, but love that is steady and unconditional. Love that stays even when they break the rules. Love that teaches without shaming. Love that disciplines without destroying. Because when children are loved like that, they don't become spoiled. They become secure. They grow into adults who aren't afraid of making mistakes, who know how to apologize, who can stand up for themselves without putting others down, who carry self-worth that isn't based on performance, but on knowing they are valued simply because they exist. You see, children aren't asking for perfect parents. They're asking for present ones who care more about connection than control, who don't reach for the rod at the first sign of defiance, but reach for understanding. They're not asking for grand gestures. Sometimes they just need a calm voice, a soft, I'm here, a hug when the world feels too loud, a moment of stillness in the chaos. That hug, that calm voice, it teaches more than any beating ever could, because it says, you matter. It says, you're safe. It says, you can grow, and I'll grow with you. And that's the kind of lesson that lasts. Not through bruises, but through trust. Not through fear, but through love. Not through silence, but through understanding. So the next time a child pushes your limits, try asking not, how do I stop this? But, what is this child really asking for beneath the noise? Because what they need, it's not a raised hand. It's a hand held out. What they need is you. Calm, clear, compassionate. Not perfect, but present. That's what teaches. That's what heals. That's what lasts. A loud slap. A child's cry. A mother yells in the middle of the street, and people turn to look. Some shake their heads. Some glance, then look away. Some say nothing at all. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the same old lines, spoken or silently approved. That kid probably deserved it. If it were me, I'd do the same. Children nowadays are too soft. We got hit all the time growing up, and look at us. We turned out fine. These words may sound harmless, familiar even, but they're not. They are echoes of a mindset that normalizes harm, and worse, that protects the one who hits instead of the one who's hurt. When a child gets hit, society too often stays silent. Not because it agrees, but because it's used to it. Because for generations, violence in the name of discipline has been wrapped in tradition, justified as love, excused as for their own good. But silence is not neutral. Silence is permission. Every time someone shrugs and says, that's how parenting works, a message is sent to the child. No one will protect you. This is normal. You have to endure. And slowly, the child learns not to cry in public. They learn to smile even when it hurts. They learn that adults are allowed to hurt them, and that no one will step in. Worse still, some parts of society actively celebrate harsh parenting. In social media comment sections, in dinner table conversations, in the way elders talk about the good old days, there's often pride in having survived harsh discipline. But survival is not healing. Just because we lived through something doesn't mean it was right. And passing down pain is not the same as passing down wisdom. This collective denial creates what psychologists call intergenerational trauma, wounds so deeply woven into a culture that they're mistaken for values. And so, when a child is hit in public, and no one intervenes, not the neighbor, not the teacher, not even the relative standing nearby, it's not always because they don't care. Sometimes it's because they're afraid. Afraid of being seen as disrespectful. Afraid of interfering in someone else's family. Afraid of challenging the idea that parents are always right. But caring in silence is not the same as speaking up. Empathy means little if it doesn't come with protection. Children don't need witnesses who watch. They need adults who act. To say, that's not okay. To offer comfort. To report when necessary. To challenge harmful norms, even when it feels uncomfortable. Some may argue, but we can't judge parents. They're under stress. That's true. Parenting is incredibly hard. Many adults were never taught healthy tools. Many are overwhelmed, unsupported, doing their best. But acknowledging their pain doesn't excuse the harm. You can have compassion for the parent and protect the child. Others say, it's a private matter, not our business. But a child's safety is everyone's business. When we treat violence as private, we create the perfect hiding place for abuse. And then there's the most dangerous belief of all. It's not that serious, but it is. It's serious when a child learns to fear their own home. It's serious when discipline crosses into trauma. It's serious when children grow up thinking love always comes with pain. The good news? Society is changing. More people are speaking out. More professionals, teachers, and even influencers are challenging outdated norms. We're starting to ask better questions. What does raising a good child really mean? Why do we excuse pain in the name of tradition? How can we support parents without sacrificing children? We're beginning to understand that real strength isn't in hitting, it's in healing. That parenting without violence isn't soft, it's wise. That protecting a child's dignity is a duty, not an opinion. Because every time someone speaks up, a child feels less alone. Every time someone interrupts, the cycle of silence cracks. Every time a community chooses care over compliance, a new legacy begins. So the next time you see a child being hurt, physically or emotionally, ask yourself, if I don't say something, who will? If we keep calling this normal, what kind of adults are we raising? What will that child remember when they look back? Because society isn't just made of systems and laws. It's made of eyes that choose to see, mouths that choose to speak, and hearts that choose not to stay silent. On paper, the child is protected. There are laws, articles, treaties, declarations. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, national laws banning abuse, provisions against domestic violence. In many countries, even a slap is technically a violation of a child's rights. But what happens beyond the paper? When a child is hit behind closed doors, who's there? When a teacher sees bruises but looks away, who protects? When neighbors hear the cries and say, that's their business, who speaks? Because the truth is painfully clear. Laws can exist without protection. Rights can be written without being respected. And children can still suffer, in silence, in secrecy, in full view of society. In too many cases, the law is a fence with no one guarding the gate. Families are often seen as sacred, untouchable spheres. What happens in the home is private. Discipline is cultural. And authority belongs to the parent, no questions asked. Even in places where corporal punishment is illegal, enforcement is inconsistent. Police may hesitate to intervene in family matters. Schools may fear upsetting parents. Social services may be underfunded, overwhelmed, or unaware. And the child? The child is expected to endure, to forgive, to be silent, or worse, to believe it's normal. Many children don't even know they have rights. They don't know they're allowed to say no to pain. They've never been taught that being small doesn't mean being powerless. So they suffer, and the law remains, a silent witness, uninvoked. It's not just a legal gap. It's a cultural one. In many societies, there's still an invisible hierarchy that places parental authority above child safety. Parents are owners. Children are property. And discipline, no matter how violent, is considered justified as long as it comes from someone who loves you. But love is not a license to harm. And protection is not just about punishment after the fact. It's about prevention, education, courage. So where is the system failing? In schools, where teachers see signs of trauma but don't report them. In families, where relatives witness abuse but stay silent out of respect or fear. In communities, where intervention is avoided for fear of causing drama. In policy, where child protection agencies are undertrained or under-resourced. In media, where violence against children is normalized, even joked about. Too often, responsibility is passed around like a hot stone, never held long enough to act. But a law without implementation is just ink. A right without access is just a dream. So what does real protection look like? It starts with awareness. Children need to be taught, from a young age, that their bodies are their own. That fear is not love. That being hurt is not something they have to accept. It continues with training. Teachers, social workers, and healthcare professionals must be equipped to spot red flags, respond with sensitivity, and act with urgency. It requires systems that listen, helplines that actually pick up, social services that follow through, courts that understand trauma, governments that fund child protection, like they fund defense. And most importantly, it needs community courage. A neighbor who checks in, a teacher who reports, a family member who refuses to stay silent, a society that no longer accepts the excuse of tradition when a child is in pain. Because no child should have to wait for the law to catch up with their bruises. No child should have to prove they are worth protecting. No child should grow up thinking no one will come for them. We must ask ourselves, what good is a law that isn't lived? What good is a right that isn't reachable? What good is protection if the protected are left alone? The law says children deserve safety. But that promise is only kept when real people make real choices to act. So if we truly care about children, not just in theory, not just in policy, but in practice, then protection can't stop at the law. It must begin in the home, be reinforced in the classroom, echoed in the neighborhood, and upheld by every adult with the power to say, I see you, I hear you, I will not let this go unseen. Because children don't need perfect laws. They need present defenders. On paper, the child is protected. There are laws, decrees, international agreements, words written in ink that declare, every child has the right to be safe. No child shall be subjected to violence, abuse, or neglect. Discipline must never cross the line into harm. And yet, behind closed doors, doors that often stay shut, children are still being hurt. Sometimes by a hand that strikes, sometimes by a voice that breaks them down, sometimes by silence, by the people who saw but chose to look away. The law exists, but where is its presence in daily life? Too often, these protections live only in courtrooms and textbooks, in public campaigns that flash across television screens for a moment, then fade. In official posters pinned to school walls that children don't even read. The real question is not whether we have laws, it's whether we apply them, whether we believe in them, whether we live by them when it's hardest to do so. Because the law can't tuck a child in at night. It can't stand in front of a raised hand. It can't walk into a house where fear lives and say, enough. That takes people who are willing to act, not just react. People who don't wait for headlines before they care. Let's be honest, in many communities, violence against children is still considered a family matter, something private, something untouchable. Teachers hesitate to report what they see. Neighbors hear screams but stay quiet. Even extended family members say, it's not our place to interfere. But when protection is optional, harm becomes acceptable. Laws are meant to define what we collectively refuse to tolerate. But when they are ignored in practice, when they are seen as suggestions instead of obligations, then they lose their power. And children lose their safety. In some countries, corporal punishment in schools is banned, but it still happens. In others, domestic abuse laws include children, but enforcement is weak or inconsistent. And in many places, emotional abuse, words that belittle, humiliate, or control, isn't even recognized by law, even though science has shown it can scar deeper than any bruise. Why the gap? Part of the problem is cultural. In societies where discipline is equated with control, and control is equated with love, it becomes hard to call out violence, even when it's obvious. Parents are seen as untouchable. Their right to raise their child how they choose is defended more fiercely than the child's right to be safe. But rights are not shields for harm. Freedom does not include the freedom to injure others, especially the most vulnerable. Another problem is lack of training. Teachers, social workers, medical staff, they may witness signs of abuse, but not know how to respond. Or worse, they may fear retaliation, or be discouraged by systems that are slow, confusing, or under-resourced. And then there's the biggest barrier of all, fear of being wrong. What if I misread the situation? What if reporting makes things worse? What if I cause more harm than good? But when in doubt, it is better to overprotect than to excuse harm. Because for the child involved, no action is often the worst action of all. So how do we close the gap between law and life? We start by changing the question from, what does the law say, to, what do I do when I see a child being hurt? How do I create an environment where that child feels safe to speak? How do I treat emotional bruises with the same urgency as physical ones? We normalize speaking up. We train those who work with children to notice the signs. We fund the systems that protect them, not just legally, but emotionally and practically. And most of all, we shift our culture. From one that says, parents know best, to one that says, children deserve better. From one that says, it's not my business, to one that says, their safety is everyone's business. From one that waits until tragedy happens, to one that prevents it. Because no law will matter if we don't embody its values. No rule will save a child unless someone steps in when it counts. And no protection is real unless it shows up in real moments, in classrooms, in living rooms, in everyday choices. So yes, the law says children are protected. But ask yourself, when was the last time I protected one? Because a safe world for children isn't written on paper. It's written in our actions. We live in a world where hurting a child is often easier than hearing them, where raising a hand takes less effort than raising a conversation, where discipline is still confused with fear, and respect mistaken for silence. But the truth is, every word we say, every choice we make, every moment we choose love over anger, is shaping a human life. A child is watching, not just what we do when they behave, but how we react when they don't. Not just how we speak to them, but how we speak to ourselves, to others, to the world. They are learning what love looks like, what safety feels like, whether they are allowed to be fully human and still fully loved. For generations, pain has been passed down like tradition, wrapped in phrases like, for your own good, or, this is how I was raised. But survival is not a standard, and repeating harm is not culture, it's a cycle waiting to be broken. Being a parent, a teacher, a guardian, or simply an adult in a child's life is not about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions. Not, how do I control this child, but how do I understand them? Not, how do I fix their behavior, but what do they need right now that they don't yet have the words to say? We don't need to be perfect. We need to be present, to pause before we react, to listen more than we lecture, to offer not just rules but reasons, to offer not just shelter but safety, because every child deserves to grow up without fear in their own home. Every child deserves to make mistakes without being made to feel small. And every child deserves to know that love is not supposed to hurt. So the next time you feel yourself about to repeat what was once done to you, stop, take a breath, look into that child's eyes, and remember, you are not just raising a child, you are shaping a future adult, one who will carry forward whatever you put in their hands now. Let it be gentleness. Let it be courage. Let it be dignity. Let it be love that teaches, not love that wounds. Because the child is watching. and the world they build tomorrow begins with how we choose to treat them today.